She collapsed at my gate like a ghost returning from the dead, the cowboy would later say. And I knew right then, some folks don't beg for help because they're weak. They beg because they've been strong for too damn long. In 1868, when Clara Whitmore's eyes finally closed in the dust of Evan Hale's ranch, she believed she was dying. She was wrong. What waited beyond that darkness wasn't death. It was a second chance she'd never asked for, offered by a man who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness is letting someone rest. If you want to see how a moment of mercy can change two lives forever, stay with me until the end. And please, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The Texas sun had no mercy that August afternoon, beating down on the parched earth with the kind of relentless heat that made mirages dance across the horizon. Evan Hale stood on the porch of his ranch house, one hand shading his eyes as he surveyed the fence line that stretched toward the distant hills. At 32, he'd built this place from nothing, every post driven into the ground by his own hands, every board cut and nailed with patience born of solitude. He was about to turn back inside when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the light, a shadow, where shadows shouldn't be. But then the shadow moved, stumbled, and fell. Evan was running before his mind fully registered what he'd seen. His boots kicked up dust as he sprinted toward the main gate, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the sudden electric awareness that something was terribly wrong. As he got closer, the shadow resolved into a shape he recognized. A person, collapsed face down in the dirt just beyond his property line. He dropped to his knees beside the figure, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. Her dress, once probably a respectable traveling outfit, was torn and filthy, stained with what looked like days or weeks of hard travel. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had once held it, now matted with dust and tangles. Her skin, where he could see it on her hands and face, was burned raw from the sun and covered in scratches and bruises. But it was her breathing that frightened him most, shallow, ragged, the sound of someone whose body was giving up the fight. "Ma'am?" Evan touched her shoulder gently, afraid she might break apart like sun-dried clay. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response, just that terrible, labored breathing. He didn't hesitate. Sliding his arms beneath her, and Lord, she weighed almost nothing, just skin and bones, he lifted her as carefully as he could and started back toward the house. She didn't stir, didn't make a sound. For a terrible moment, he wondered if she'd already slipped away. But no. He could feel the faint flutter of her heartbeat against his chest, stubborn and persistent despite everything. The house seemed impossibly far away, though it was only a couple hundred yards. Evan had carried full-grown steers that felt lighter than this woman, not because of her weight, but because of what she represented. A responsibility he hadn't asked for, a life now dependent on his choices. He kicked open the door to his bedroom, the only real bedroom in the small ranch house, and laid her carefully on the bed. In the better light, he could see more details, and each one made his jaw tighten with anger at whatever had brought her to this state. Bruises darkened her arms. Her fingernails were broken and bloody. There was a gash on her temple, partially hidden by her hair, that looked days old and infected. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. "Jesus," he muttered, then immediately felt guilty for the blasphemy, even though there was no one to hear it but an unconscious woman and his own conscience. He'd seen men come back from war looking better than this. Evan had never claimed to be a doctor, but frontier life had taught him the basics of survival medicine. He worked quickly, driven by the fear that any delay might be the difference between life and death. First, water, just a little at a time, carefully spooned between her cracked lips. Most of it dribbled out, but some went down. That was good. That was something. He cleaned the wound on her temple as gently as he could, wincing at the way she flinched even in unconsciousness. The scratches on her arms and hands got the same treatment, water, then a weak solution of carbolic acid he kept for treating injured animals. It would have to do. Her dress was ruined, that much was clear, but he couldn't very well undress an unconscious woman he didn't know. Instead, he covered her with every blanket he owned, knowing that despite the heat of the day, someone in her condition would likely get the chills as her body tried to recover. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. Evan pulled his single chair close to the bedside and sat down heavily, suddenly aware of how his own heart was racing. He studied the woman's face, trying to piece together her story from the evidence before him. She was young, maybe mid-20s, he guessed, though it was hard to tell beneath the dirt and damage. There was something refined in the structure of her face, the kind of bone structure that spoke of good breeding and genteel upbringing. Her hands, despite the current state of them, didn't have the calluses of someone who'd spent her life in hard labor. Eastern, probably. Maybe from a city. Definitely not from around here. But what was an Eastern woman doing collapsed at his gate in the middle of nowhere, Texas? And where had she come from? The sun was setting by the time she finally stirred. Evan had dozed off in the chair, his chin dropped to his chest, when a soft moan startled him awake. He leaned forward immediately, watching as her eyelids fluttered. "Ma'am? Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, green, he noticed, a deep green like spring grass, and stared up at him without comprehension. For a moment there was just blankness, as if her mind was taking its time catching up to her body. Then awareness flooded back in, and with it, fear. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. A strangled sound escaped her throat. Not quite a scream, but close. "Easy, easy," Evan said, holding his hands up in what he hoped was a calming gesture. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you. You collapsed at my gate. I brought you inside." She stared at him, chest heaving with panic, eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. He could see her trying to piece together where she was, how she'd gotten here, whether she was in danger. "Water," she finally whispered, the word barely audible, her voice like gravel scraping against gravel. Evan was already reaching for the cup. He helped her sit up just enough to drink without choking, supporting her head with one hand while holding the cup with the other. She drank desperately, too fast, and he had to pull the cup away. "Slow," he said gently. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She nodded, understanding in her eyes even as they filled with tears, whether from relief or distress, he couldn't tell. He gave her more water, slowly, until she'd had enough to ease the worst of the thirst. Then he lowered her back onto the pillows and sat back in his chair, giving her space. "What's your name, ma'am?" She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Whitmore. I'm Evan Hale. This is my ranch. You're safe here." Something in those words, "you're safe here," broke whatever dam she'd been holding inside. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her whole body began to shake with silent sobs. Evan felt helpless, watching her cry, wanting to comfort her but knowing that any touch from a strange man might make things worse. So he just sat there, present but not imposing, letting her grieve whatever needed to be grieved. It was full dark by the time the crying stopped. Clara lay still, her eyes closed, but Evan could tell she wasn't asleep, just exhausted beyond measure. "I'll let you rest," he said quietly, starting to stand. "No." Her hand shot out, catching his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes opened, meeting his with an intensity that stopped him cold. "Please, don't leave. I can't be alone right now." Evan settled back into the chair. "I won't go anywhere," he promised. And he didn't. He sat there through the long night while Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally stirring with nightmares that made her whimper and thrash. Each time he would speak softly, meaningless words of comfort, just sound to anchor her, until she calmed again. By the time dawn light began creeping through the window, Evan had dozed off again, his head tilted back against the wall, one hand resting on the edge of the bed where Clara's fingers were still loosely curled around his wrist. When he woke, she was watching him. "You stayed," she said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if the concept of someone keeping a promise was foreign to her. "Said I would." Clara studied his face for a long moment, and Evan got the sense that she was trying to measure his character, to determine whether she could trust this strange cowboy who'd pulled her back from the edge of death. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she finally spoke again, her voice stronger than the night before, though still weak. "I need to tell you what happened. You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." She struggled to sit up, and this time he helped her, propping pillows behind her back. "You deserve to know what—" what you've gotten yourself into by helping me." Evan pulled the chair closer and sat down, giving her his full attention. Clara took a shaky breath. "I was traveling with a wagon train. We were coming from Missouri, heading to California. There were 12 wagons, maybe 50 people total. My family, my parents, my younger brother, we were in the third wagon." She paused, her hands twisting in the blanket, and Evan could see the effort it took to continue. "We were 5 days out from Fort Griffin when they came. Raiders. I don't know if they were Comanche or just white men dressed like Comanche. It happened so fast, everything was chaos and screaming and—" Her voice broke, but she pushed on, driven by some need to purge the story from her soul. "My father told me to run. He and my brother were fighting, trying to give people time to escape, and my mother was already—" She closed her eyes. "She was already gone. My father shouted at me to run, to hide, so I did. I crawled under our wagon, and then I just ran. Into the scrub, into the darkness. I ran until I couldn't breathe, and then I hid." Evan felt his hands clenching into fists, but he kept his voice calm. "How long ago?" "I don't know, maybe 2 weeks, 3? The days all blurred together. I've been walking, hiding during the day when I could, trying to find anything, anyone. But there's just nothing out here. Nothing but emptiness." "You walked for 3 weeks?" Evan couldn't hide his shock. That kind of survival, alone, without provisions, in hostile territory, it was almost impossible. "I found water a few times, a creek, some puddles after a rain, and I—" She looked away, ashamed. "I ate insects, roots, anything I could find. I knew if I stopped, I'd die. So I kept walking." The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of all she'd endured. Evan found himself revising his entire estimation of this fragile-looking woman. There was steel underneath the bruises and exhaustion, steel that had kept her alive through hell. "I'm sorry," he finally said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "I'm so damn sorry that happened to you." Clara's eyes met his, and he saw something fierce flash in them. "I survived," she said simply. "I don't know why I survived when everyone else, when my family, but I did. And I'm not going to waste that." "No," Evan agreed. "You're not." Over the next few days, Clara slowly regained her strength. Evan moved into the bunkhouse, a small spare room he'd built for hired hands he rarely employed, giving Clara the privacy of the main bedroom. He cooked simple meals and brought them to her on a tray: cornbread and beans, eggs when the chickens were generous, venison from his last hunt. She protested at first, insisting she could come to the table, but he could see how even sitting up exhausted her. Her body needed time to recover from what it had been through. On the third day, he found her trying to stand when he brought in breakfast. She'd made it to her feet, one hand braced against the wall, but her legs were shaking so badly he thought she might collapse. "Whoa there," he said, setting the tray down and moving to steady her. "What are you doing?" "I need to get up," Clara said through gritted teeth. "I can't just lie in bed while you—" Her legs gave out, and Evan caught her, lowering her back to sit on the edge of the bed. "You can and you will," he said firmly. "Clara, you walked for 3 weeks on nothing but bugs and rainwater. Your body has been through a trauma most people wouldn't survive. You need to rest." "I can work," she insisted, and there was desperation in her voice now. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not useless. I can earn my keep. Please, I can't just—" "No." The single word, spoken quietly but with absolute finality, stopped her mid-sentence. Evan knelt down so he was at her eye level, his hands still steadying her shoulders. "Listen to me. You don't have to earn anything. You don't owe me. I don't keep a ledger of kindness, Clara. You're here because you need to be, and that's enough." "But I can't just take advantage of—" "You're not taking advantage. You're recovering. There's a difference." He stood up, running a hand through his hair in frustration, not at her, but at whatever had taught her that accepting help meant being weak. "When you're strong enough, if you want to help around the place, fine. But right now your only job is to heal. You understand me?" Clara looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears again. "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question caught him off guard. Why was he? He'd lived alone for 6 years, preferring solitude to the complications of society. He could have taken her to Fort Griffin, left her with the army doctor, washed his hands of the responsibility. But standing there, looking at this woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd kept walking when any reasonable person would have laid down and died, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Because someone should be, he said finally. Because you've been through hell, and you deserve a moment of peace because, he paused, searching for words, because it's the right thing to do, that's all. Clara nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll rest. But Evan? Yeah? Thank you. I know I keep saying it, but thank you. You don't have to keep saying it. Just get better. A week passed, then 2. Clara grew stronger day by day, the color returning to her cheeks, the worst of the bruises fading to yellow and green before disappearing entirely. The gash on her temple healed cleanly, leaving a small scar that she would sometimes touch absently, as if reminding herself of how far she'd come. True to his word, Evan didn't push her to do anything. He kept cooking, kept cleaning, kept maintaining the ranch while Clara rested. But he could see the restlessness growing in her, the way she watched him work with increasing frustration at her own inactivity. On the morning of the 15th day, he came inside to find her standing in the kitchen, fully dressed for the first time since she'd arrived. She'd found one of his old shirts and a pair of trousers that she'd somehow altered to fit her smaller frame. Her hair was braided back neatly, and there was a determined set to her jaw that he was starting to recognize. "I'm helping today," she announced before he could say anything. "And before you argue, let me point out that I walked here from the kitchen without collapsing. I'm not dizzy, and I'm going absolutely mad lying in that bed. So unless you plan to tie me down, I'm going to make myself useful." Evan couldn't help the smile that tugged at his lips. "Is that right?" "That's right." He studied her for a moment, taking in the strength that had returned to her stance, the clarity in her eyes. She was still too thin, still had a ways to go before she'd be fully recovered. But she was right. She was ready for this. "All right," he conceded, "but we start small. And the second you feel tired, you stop. Agreed?" "Agreed." They fell into an easy rhythm that day. Clara insisted on making breakfast, and though Evan hovered nearby, ready to catch her if she fell, she moved through the kitchen with practiced competence. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the coffee strong and hot, the biscuits surprisingly good. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked around a mouthful of biscuit. "My mother," Clara said, and though sadness flickered across her face, it didn't consume her this time. She believed every woman should know how to run a household, regardless of station. "I used to think it was silly. We had servants who could do all of this. But now—" She trailed off, looking down at her hands. "Now I'm grateful she insisted." After breakfast, she washed the dishes while Evan went out to tend to the horses. When he came back, he found her sweeping the floor, humming softly to herself. The sound stopped him in his tracks. It was the first time he'd heard anything like happiness from her. "You like to sing?" he asked. Clara looked up, startled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I used to, before." "You should sing more. The house could use it." She smiled, a real smile. Not the polite expression she'd been wearing, but something genuine and warm. "Maybe I will." The days began to develop a pattern. Clara would wake early and make breakfast. Evan would handle the heavy ranch work, mending fences, working with the horses, checking on the small herd of cattle he ran. Clara would clean, cook, mend his clothes that had been slowly falling apart from neglect. But it was more than just work. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk. Clara told him about her life before. Growing up in St. Louis, the grand house her father had owned, the parties and social obligations that had seemed so important at the time. Evan told her about building the ranch, about the years he'd spent drifting after the war before finally finding this piece of land and deciding to put down roots. They didn't talk about the attack, and Evan didn't push. He figured she'd tell him more when she was ready. 3 weeks into her recovery, Evan rode into town for supplies. It was a half-day journey to the nearest settlement, barely more than a trading post, a saloon, and a few scattered buildings. But it was the only place to get flour, coffee, and other necessities. He left Clara with strict instructions to rest, not to overdo it while he was gone, and to fire the rifle he'd left for her if there was any trouble. When he returned just before sunset, he found the house transformed. She'd cleaned everything, Not just a surface cleaning, but a deep, thorough scrubbing that made the rough wood floors gleam and the windows sparkle. She'd organized his chaotic pantry, arranged his scattered books into neat stacks, even found some wildflowers and put them in a jar on the table. But what stopped him cold was the smell coming from the kitchen. "Is that apple pie?" he asked, setting down his saddlebags and staring at her in amazement. Clara turned from the stove, wiping her hands on an apron she must have made from spare fabric. "You had apples from last fall in the cellar. They were starting to turn, so I thought—" She shrugged, suddenly looking uncertain. "I thought you might like something sweet." Evan just stood there, overwhelmed by the simple domesticity of it all. He'd lived alone for so long, eating cold beans from a can more often than not, living in barely controlled chaos. In just a few hours, Clara had turned his house into something that felt like a home. "I overdid it, didn't I?" Clara said, misreading his silence. "You told me to rest, and I—" "No," Evan interrupted. "No, you didn't overdo it. This is—" He gestured around helplessly. "This is wonderful, Clara. Thank you." They ate dinner at the table, real dinner, with plates and forks and the apple pie for dessert. And for the first time since the war, Evan felt something in his chest loosen, something that had been wound tight for years, keeping everyone at arm's length, protecting himself from connection. It was dangerous, he knew. Clara would eventually leave, would go back to wherever she belonged, and he'd be alone again. But for now, in this moment, with the lamplight soft on her face and the taste of apple pie on his tongue, he let himself enjoy it. "Tell me about the ranch," Clara said suddenly. "How did you end up out here?" Evan leaned back in his chair, considering how much to share. "After the war, I couldn't go back home. Too many memories, too many ghosts. So I drifted west, working cattle drives, hiring on at different ranches, saved my money. One day I found this land, and it just felt right. So I bought it, built the house, started small with a few head of cattle." "Do you have family, people who worry about you?" "My parents died when I was young. No siblings. There's nobody left who'd notice if I disappeared tomorrow." Clara's expression softened with understanding. "I know that feeling now, to be unmoored from everything you knew." "Yeah." He paused, then added quietly, "But you're not alone anymore, Clara. Not while you're here." Something shifted between them in that moment. A understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of shared loneliness. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Neither are you," she said. The first month turned into 6 weeks, then 2 months. Clara grew stronger, taking on more responsibilities around the ranch. She proved surprisingly adept with the chickens, coaxing them to produce more eggs than Evan had gotten in months. She learned to milk the cow he kept, to churn butter, to smoke meat for preservation. But more than that, she learned the rhythms of ranch life. The way the wind changed before a storm, the sound of a coyote versus a wolf. How to read the sky for weather, the grass for season, the animals for their needs. And Evan learned about her. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, more resilient than anyone he'd ever met. He learned that she had a sharp mind and a sharper wit, that she could make him laugh with a dry observation about his terrible coffee, or the way he talked to his horses like they understood every word. He learned that she had nightmares most nights, though she tried to hide it. Sometimes he would hear her cry out from the bunkhouse where he slept, and he would lie awake, fists clenched, wanting to go to her but knowing she needed her privacy. One morning in early October, Evan came in from the morning chores to find Clara standing at the window, a letter in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Clara, what is it?" She turned to him, holding out the letter with a shaking hand. "It's from my uncle, my mother's brother. He lives in Boston. Somehow he heard about the attack and he's been trying to find me. He wants me to come live with him." Evan felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When?" "He says he can send money for train fare. He wants me to come as soon as possible." She looked down at the letter, her voice breaking. "He's the only family I have left, Evan, my only connection to my old life." "Then you should go." The words hurt to say, but he forced them out. "You should be with family." Clara looked up at him, searching his face. "Is that what you want? For me to go?" What he wanted was for her to stay, to keep making this house feel like a home, to keep sitting across from him at dinner and laughing at his bad jokes and filling the silence with her presence. But what he wanted didn't matter. "I want you to be happy," he said carefully. "I want you to be safe. If that means going to Boston, then yes, that's what I want." She stared at him for a long moment, then folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. "I need to think about this." "Of course." But as the days passed and Clara grew quieter, more withdrawn, Evan felt the inevitable approaching. She was going to leave. She was going to choose the safety and security of family over the hard life of a remote ranch. And he couldn't blame her, not after everything she'd been through. He just wished it didn't hurt quite so much to imagine this place without her. The evening before Clara had to make her decision, they sat on the porch as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red. They'd barely spoken all day, the weight of the choice hanging between them like a physical thing. "Tell me honestly," Clara finally said, breaking the silence. "If I stay, what kind of life would I have here?" Evan chose his words carefully. "It would be hard. Lonely sometimes, especially in winter when the snows come. The nearest town is half a day's ride, and it's not much of a town. You'd work from sunup to sundown most days. There's no society here, no parties or theaters or any of the things you grew up with. What else? You'd have purpose," he continued. "The work matters here. Every egg you collect, every meal you cook, every fence we mend together, it all matters. You'd have space to breathe, to heal, to become whoever you want to be without anyone judging you for it." "Would I have you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Evan turned to look at her, really look at her, in the fading light. This woman who had stumbled into his life broken and desperate, who had somehow put herself back together while simultaneously making him whole in ways he hadn't even realized he was broken. "Yes," he said simply, "for as long as you wanted." Clara nodded slowly, then stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the darkening landscape. Evan waited, hardly breathing, while she wrestled with her decision. Finally, she turned back to face him. "I'm going to write to my uncle tomorrow," she said, and Evan felt his heart sink. But then she continued, "I'm going to thank him for his generous offer, and I'm going to tell him that I've found a home here, that I've found a life worth living, and a man worth building it with." Evan stood slowly, afraid to believe what he was hearing. "You're staying?" "I'm staying," Clara confirmed, and the smile that broke across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. "If you'll have me." He crossed the porch in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She wrapped her arms around him and held on just as fiercely, both of them anchoring themselves to this moment, this choice, this beginning. "I'll have you," Evan whispered into her hair. "For as long as you'll stay, I'll have you." They stood there as full darkness fell, 2 survivors who had found each other against all odds, holding on to the promise of something neither of them had dared to hope for, a future built not on obligation or necessity, but on freely given choice and the quiet certainty that sometimes the best homes are the ones we build ourselves. The letter to Clara's uncle was written the next morning, her hand steady as she formed the words that would seal her decision. Evan watched from across the table, pretending to read a week-old newspaper while his eyes kept drifting to her bent head, the way morning light caught in her dark hair. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully, sealed it with wax, and set it aside with a finality that made something in Evan's chest settle. "That's done then," she said quietly. "Any regrets?" Clara met his eyes directly. "Not a single one." But if Evan had expected their relationship to shift immediately into something more, he was mistaken. Clara seemed content to let things unfold naturally, and he found himself grateful for the patience. They'd both survived too much to rush into something neither fully understood yet. Instead, they fell into a deeper rhythm together, one that felt less like guest and host, and more like partners building something permanent. The first real test came 2 weeks later when the autumn rains started. Not the gentle showers that blessed the earth and moved on, but the kind of relentless downpour that turned the ground to mud and threatened to wash away everything that wasn't secured. Evan woke before dawn to the sound of water hammering on the roof and knew immediately they were in trouble. He found Clara already in the kitchen, fully dressed and lacing up her boots. She'd clearly heard it too. The east pasture, Evan said without preamble. There's a gully that runs through it. If this keeps up, it'll flood and we'll lose the fence line. Maybe some cattle too. What do we need to do? We need to move the herd to higher ground before that gully becomes a river. He grabbed his rain slicker from the peg by the door, then hesitated. Clara, this is going to be rough. Cold, wet, dangerous. You don't have to… Don't. She cut him off, her voice firm. Don't start treating me like I'm fragile again. I can help. Tell me what to do. Something fierce and proud swelled in Evan's chest. He nodded once, then grabbed a second rain slicker, one of his old ones that would be too big for her but would keep her mostly dry. All right then, let's move. They rode out into the storm together, the rain so heavy it was like riding through a waterfall. Clara handled her horse, a gentle mare named Daisy that Evan had given her to use, with more confidence than he'd expected. She'd been practicing while he worked, he realized, learning to ride properly instead of just sitting astride. The cattle were already nervous, bunched together near the fence line closest to the rising water. Evan could see the gully in the distance, already swollen and angry, pushing against its banks. We need to push them west, he shouted over the rain, toward the high ground near the house. You take the left flank, I'll take the right. Just keep them moving in the right direction. Clara nodded and moved into position without hesitation. What followed was 2 hours of brutal, exhausting work. The cattle didn't want to move, spooked by the storm and stubborn in the way that only cattle could be. Clara rode back and forth along her flank, calling out to the animals, using her presence to guide them where they needed to go. Evan watched her when he could, marveling at her determination. She was soaked through within minutes, her hair plastered to her head, but she never faltered. When one of the steers broke from the group and tried to bolt back toward the flooding gully, she wheeled Daisy around and cut it off, driving it back with the others. By the time they got the herd to safety, both of them were shaking with cold and exhaustion. But the cattle were secure on high ground, and the fence line could be repaired once the storm passed. They rode back to the house in silence, too tired for words. Evan took care of the horses while Clara went inside to change. When he finally made it in, she had the fire roaring and coffee brewing. She'd changed into dry clothes and had laid out dry things for him too. Thank you, he said, taking the coffee she offered with hands that were still trembling slightly from the cold. For what? For not giving up out there. For being stronger than I gave you credit for. Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup, steam rising between them. I told you I wasn't fragile. I just needed time to remember who I was before everything happened, before I became just a survivor. And who are you? She considered the question seriously. I'm still figuring that out, but I know I'm someone who doesn't run from hard work, someone who keeps her promises, someone who's building a life worth living. I like that person, Evan said quietly. So do I, finally. The weeks that followed brought more challenges. A section of roof needed repair before winter came in earnest. One of the horses threw a shoe and came up lame, requiring careful nursing. The vegetable garden Clara had planted in late summer needed to be harvested before the first frost. Each challenge they faced together, and each success made the partnership between them stronger. But it was the small moments that Evan treasured most. Clara humming while she worked in the kitchen. The way she'd started leaving little improvements around the house, curtains she'd sewn, a braided rug she'd made from scraps, wildflowers on the table, even as autumn deepened toward winter. The sound of her laughter when he told her about the time he'd accidentally released all the chickens and spent an entire day trying to round them up. One evening in late October, they sat by the fire after dinner, Clara mending one of his shirts while Evan worked on repairing a bridle. The comfortable silence between them was broken by Clara's thoughtful voice. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why did you never marry? Build a family? You've had this place for 6 years. That's a long time to be alone. Evan's hand stilled on the leather. It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself more than once. After the war, I wasn't fit for company. Too much darkness in my head, too many nightmares. I figured I'd work through it alone, and by the time I felt human again, being alone had become a habit. And now? He looked up at her, meeting her eyes in the firelight. Now I'm realizing that some habits need to be broken. Clara set down her mending and moved to sit beside him on the floor near the fire. I was supposed to be married, before the wagon train. There was a man in St. Louis, Thomas Whitfield. He was appropriate, well-connected, everything my parents wanted for me. Evan felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. What happened? I realized I didn't love him. I barely knew him, really. We'd had perhaps a dozen chaperoned conversations, but my parents were so excited about the match. And I thought maybe love would come later, the way everyone said it would. She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Then my father lost his business, bad investments, debts he couldn't pay. Suddenly we weren't good enough for the Whitfields anymore. Thomas broke the engagement. That's why we were heading west, to start over in California, away from the scandal and shame. I'm sorry. Clara shook her head. Don't be. If Thomas had married me, I'd be living a life that was never really mine. I'd be someone's wife, someone's decoration, playing a role in a society that never felt quite real to me. Here, everything is real. The work matters. The choices matter. I matter. Evan reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You've always mattered, Clara. Some people were just too blind to see it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither one wanting to break the moment by moving. November brought the first real cold, the kind that made breath fog and turned morning water buckets to ice. Evan taught Clara how to prepare the ranch for winter, banking earth around the foundation to keep the cold out, checking and rechecking the wood supply, making sure the animals had adequate shelter. She proved to be a quick study, asking intelligent questions and remembering everything he taught her. More than that, she started anticipating needs before he could voice them, working alongside him with an efficiency that spoke of genuine partnership. It was during one of these preparations that disaster nearly struck. Evan was up on the barn roof, replacing shingles that had loosened during the autumn storms, while Clara handed up materials from below. He'd been working for maybe an hour when he reached for a shingle without looking and felt his foot slip on the wet wood. He fell hard, sliding down the sloped roof with nothing to grab onto. His mind had just enough time to register that this was going to hurt before Clara's voice cut through the panic. The rope! Grab the rope! He twisted, saw the safety line he'd rigged that morning. At Clara's insistence, he remembered now, and caught it with both hands. The rope jerked tight, stopping his slide a few feet from the edge. For a moment he just hung there, heart hammering, looking down at the ground that would have broken bones if not for Clara's foresight. Don't move! Clara was already climbing up, moving carefully but quickly across the roof until she reached him. Together they worked him back to the ladder and down to solid ground. Evan's hands were shaking as he stood there, processing how close that had been. Clara's face was pale but set with determination. You could have died, she said, her voice tight. But I didn't, because you thought of the rope. Because I've already lost everyone I loved once. I'm not doing it again. The words came out fierce and raw, and Evan realized this was the first time she'd said it out loud, that she loved him. He pulled her close, holding her tight against him. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. Not if I can help it. You can't promise that. Life doesn't work that way. No, he agreed. But I can promise to be as careful as possible, to listen when you tell me to rig a safety rope, to not take stupid risks just because I've always done things alone. Clara pulled back just enough to look up at him. I'm holding you to that. I know you will. That night, something shifted again. After dinner, as Clara stood to clear the dishes, Evan caught her hand. Stay, he said simply. Sit with me a while. She settled beside him at the table, and he found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. About the war, not the glory that people imagined, but the mud and blood and fear. About the friends he'd lost, the choices he'd had to make, the weight of survival when so many hadn't survived. Clara listened without judgment, her hand steady in his, and when he finally ran out of words, she shared her own darkness in return. The sounds of the attack that still woke her at night, the guilt of surviving when her family hadn't, the fear that she'd never feel truly safe again. But I do feel safe here, she added quietly. With you, That's why I stayed. I'm glad you did. I don't think I realized how alone I was until you showed me what it felt like not to be. They talked long into the night, the lamp burning low, building a foundation of honesty and shared pain that was stronger than any built on pretense or romance alone. December arrived with snow that blanketed the ranch in white silence. Clara had never experienced a real winter, and despite the hardship it brought, Evan couldn't help but smile at her wonder when she saw the landscape transformed overnight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, standing at the window with her hands pressed against the cold glass. "It's dangerous," Evan corrected, but gently. "Beautiful, yes, but we need to be prepared. The next town supply run needs to happen soon before the roads become impassable." "Then let's go together." Evan hesitated. He'd been making the supply runs alone for years, and the journey with snow coming could be treacherous. But he also understood what she was asking, to be included, to be trusted as a full partner in this life they were building. "All right," he agreed. "We'll go tomorrow if the weather holds." They set out before dawn, the wagon packed with items to trade: eggs, smoked meat, butter Clara had churned. The journey that took half a day in summer took nearly a full day in winter, the wagon moving slowly through snow-covered ruts. Clara handled the cold better than Evan expected, wrapped in layers and blankets, her face bright with interest as they traveled. She asked questions about the land, the history of the area, the other ranchers they might encounter. Evan found himself seeing the familiar landscape through her eyes, rediscovering details he'd stopped noticing years ago. When they finally reached the trading post, Clara's presence caused a stir. The settlement was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and a new face, especially a woman's face, was noteworthy. Martha Sullivan, who ran the trading post with her husband, descended on them immediately. She was a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a heart bigger than Texas. "Evan Hale, you've been holding out on us," she declared, looking Clara up and down with frank curiosity. "Who's this?" "Martha, this is Clara Whitmore. She's been staying at the ranch. Clara, Martha Sullivan knows everything that happens within 100 miles. "Don't believe a word he says," Martha said, but she was smiling. "Though in this case, he's not wrong. Come inside, dear, before you freeze. And Evan, you look half-starved as usual. When are you going to learn to cook a proper meal?" Clara and Martha disappeared into the trading post, leaving Evan to handle the wagon with Martha's husband, George. The older man gave him a knowing look. "That's quite a woman you've got there, Evan." "She's not... We're not..." Evan trailed off, realizing he didn't know how to explain their relationship. What were they? Friends? Partners? Something more that neither had been brave enough to name? George chuckled. "Whatever you say, but a word of advice from an old married man. Don't wait too long to figure it out. Good women don't stay unattached forever, especially out here where they're scarce as hen's teeth." Inside, Clara was being interrogated by Martha with the kind of gentle ruthlessness that only well-meaning older women could achieve. Evan could hear snippets of conversation as he brought in supplies. "Wagon train attack, you poor thing. All alone for 3 weeks? You're a miracle. And Evan just took you in? Well, I'll be. That man's got more heart than he lets on." When Evan finally joined them, he found Clara laughing at something Martha had said, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her in weeks. Martha had clearly decided Clara was worth approving of, which meant the whole settlement would know about her by tomorrow and would generally be welcoming. They traded their goods for flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities, plus some luxuries Martha insisted on including: real tea, a bar of good soap, even a jar of honey. "For the holidays," she said firmly when Evan tried to protest the generosity. On the ride home, as twilight painted the snow blue and purple, Clara was quiet in a thoughtful way. "What are you thinking about?" Evan asked. "Martha asked me if I was planning to stay. At the ranch, I mean, long term." "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes, and she said..." Clara paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She said it was good that you finally had someone, that you'd been alone too long and it had worried her. She said you needed someone to remind you to live, not just survive." Evan was quiet for a moment, watching the horse's breath fog in the cold air. "She's not wrong. That's what I'd been doing, just surviving day after day until surviving was all I knew how to do. And now? Now I'm learning that there's more to life than just getting through it. You taught me that. Clara shifted closer to him on the wagon seat, and without thinking about it, Evan put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, two people moving towards something they could both finally see taking shape. The week before Christmas, Evan rode out to check on a section of fence in the north pasture. Clara had wanted to come, but they'd decided someone should stay at the ranch to keep the fires going and the animals fed. He expected to be gone maybe 3 hours. He was gone for 10. It started with a fence that was more damaged than he'd thought, requiring extensive repair. Then one of the cows had wandered farther than expected, requiring tracking and retrieval. By the time he started back, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. He pushed the horse harder than he should have, worried about Clara alone at the ranch as darkness fell. When he finally rode into the yard, he found every lamp in the house burning and Clara standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her face tight with worry. "Where were you?" she demanded as he dismounted. "You said 3 hours. It's been 10. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought something had happened to you." Evan climbed the porch steps and took her cold hands in his. "I'm sorry. The fence was worse than I thought, and one of the cows had wandered. I should have come back and told you I'd be longer." "Yes, you should have." There were tears in her eyes now. "Do you have any idea what it's like to wait and wonder? To imagine finding you frozen somewhere, or thrown from your horse, or attacked by wolves, or any of 100 other horrible things?" "Clara, I already lost everyone once. I won't survive losing you too." The tears spilled over. "So you need to promise me. Promise me you'll be careful, that you'll come back, that you won't make me sit here wondering if I'm about to be alone again." Evan pulled her into his arms, feeling her shake against him. "I promise. I'm sorry I scared you. I'll be more careful, more thoughtful. I promise." They stood there on the porch, holding each other as the temperature dropped and the stars came out, and Evan realized something that had probably been true for weeks, but that he was only now brave enough to acknowledge. He was in love with her. Completely, irrevocably in love with this strong, stubborn, beautiful woman who had crashed into his solitary life and made him want things he'd given up on years ago. But he didn't say it. Not yet. Clara had been through too much, lost too much, to hear those words from a place of fear and relief. When he told her, it would be from a place of certainty and strength, not because she'd been worried about him. Inside, Clara had prepared dinner, a venison stew that filled the house with warmth and rich smells. They ate in companionable silence, the earlier tension easing into something gentler. "Martha invited us to their Christmas gathering," Clara said as she cleared the dishes. "A few families from the surrounding ranches get together. She said it's nothing fancy, but there's food and music and company. Do you want to go?" Clara hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me wants to meet people, to feel like part of a community again. But part of me is afraid. Of the questions, the sympathy, the way people look at survivors." Evan understood that. "We don't have to decide now. Think about it. If you want to go, we'll go. If you'd rather stay here, that's fine too." But as Christmas approached, Evan could see Clara wavering toward yes. She'd started baking extra bread, making preserves, all the things someone would bring to a gathering. And on Christmas Eve morning, she came to him with determination in her eyes. "I want to go. I want to stop hiding from life because I'm afraid of what people might think. And I want—" She paused, then continued more quietly. "I want people to see us together, to see that I'm not just some charity case you took in, but someone who belongs here, with you." "You do belong here," Evan said firmly. "Anyone who meets you will see that." They arrived at the Sullivans' place just after noon, the wagon loaded with Clara's contributions. The house was full of people, ranchers and their families, shopkeepers, the few others who made up the scattered community. Children ran underfoot, and the smell of cooking filled the air with promise. Martha welcomed them like family, immediately drawing Clara into the group of women organizing food while the men gathered around the fire, drinking coffee and trading stories. Evan found himself watching Clara across the room, seeing how she smiled and laughed, how she held her own in conversation, how she'd bloomed in the months since she'd arrived at his gate, more dead than alive. George Sullivan appeared at his elbow, following his gaze. "You've got it bad, son." "What?" "Don't play dumb. You look at that woman the way I looked at Martha 40 years ago. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know," Evan admitted. "Everything happened so fast. Her arriving, getting better, deciding to stay. I don't want to push her into something she's not ready for." "Have you asked her what she's ready for? Or are you just assuming?" Evan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. George had a point. He'd been so focused on giving Clara space to heal, on not taking advantage of her vulnerability, that he'd never actually asked what she wanted. "Talk to her," George advised. "Life's too short and uncertain out here to waste time on assumptions. Trust me on that." As evening fell and people began gathering for dinner, Clara found her way to Evan's side. They'd barely had a moment alone since arriving, but now, in the bustle of people preparing to eat, they stood together near the window, watching snow begin to fall outside. "Are you having a good time?" Evan asked. "I am. Everyone's been so welcoming. It feels—" She searched for the word. "It feels like community, like belonging somewhere." "You do belong, here, in this community, at the ranch, with me." Clara turned to look up at him, something serious in her eyes. "Do I? Really? Because sometimes I wonder if you're just being kind, if you feel obligated because you saved my life, if—" "Clara." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I need you to listen to me. What I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation. You're not some responsibility I'm shouldering. You're—" He struggled to find the right words, aware that people were moving around them, but needing her to hear this. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. You make that empty ranch feel like home. You make me want to be better, do better. And I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you've been through hell, but Clara, Dinner's ready!" Martha's voice rang out and the moment shattered. People began moving toward the tables, and Evan had to release Clara's hands, the words he'd been about to say locked back inside. But Clara's eyes were bright, and her fingers squeezed his once before letting go. "Later," she whispered. "We'll talk later." Later came after dinner, after the music and dancing, after they'd said their goodbyes and climbed back into the wagon for the long ride home. The snow had picked up, falling thick and fast, but the horses knew the way even when the path was obscured. Clara sat close to Evan, sharing the blankets and warmth, and after a while she spoke into the quiet night. "What were you going to say?" Before Martha interrupted, Evan kept his eyes on the road ahead, gathering his courage. "I was going to say that I love you, that I'm in love with you, have been for weeks now, maybe from the moment you looked at me with those fierce eyes and insisted you could work. I know it's fast, and I know you might not feel the same way, and that's all right. But you needed to know. You needed to know that when I ask you to stay, it's not charity or kindness. It's love." For a long moment, Clara was silent, and Evan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then she laughed, a soft, joyful sound that cut through the falling snow. "You really are terrible at timing, aren't you? First you almost confess in the middle of a Christmas party. Now you're telling me you love me while driving a wagon through a snowstorm." "I'm sorry, Don't be sorry. I love you too, Evan Hale. I think I have since you refused to let me work and told me my only job was to heal. Since you sat beside my bed all night because I was afraid to be alone. Since you showed me that kindness doesn't have to come with conditions." Evan pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the snowy road. He turned to Clara, cupping her face in his cold hands, and kissed her. She kissed him back, and it was sweet and right, and felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, snowflakes catching in their hair and on their eyelashes. "So what happens now?" Clara asked. "Now we go home," Evan said simply. "And we build the life we both want. Together." They rode the rest of the way through the snow with Clara nestled against Evan's side. Both of them quiet but content, knowing that they'd turned a corner that couldn't be turned back. The ranch appeared through the white curtain of falling snow, lights they'd left burning welcoming them home, and Evan felt a swell of gratitude for the woman beside him and the life they were creating together. Winter deepened around them, but inside the ranch house, warmth bloomed in ways that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. The confession of love had changed something fundamental between Clara and Evan, stripping away the last vestiges of formality and hesitation. They moved through their days with an ease that felt both brand new and ancient, as if they'd been doing this dance for years instead of months. January brought the hardest cold Evan had seen in years, the kind that froze water solid within minutes and made every breath burn in the lungs. They worked together to keep the animals alive and the house warm, their partnership tested by the relentless weather and emerging stronger for it. It was during one of those brutal cold snaps, as they huddled close to the fire after a long day of breaking ice and hauling feed, that Clara asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. "When are you going to ask me to marry you?" Evan nearly choked on his coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" Clara's eyes sparkled with amusement and challenge. "You heard me. We've confessed we love each other. We're living together, working together, building a life together. The only thing we haven't done is make it official. So when are you going to ask?" "I didn't think you'd want to rush into marriage. After everything with Thomas, after the attack, I thought you'd need time." "I've had time. Months of it, and I know what I want." She set down her own cup and turned to face him fully. "I want this. You, me, the ranch, a future we build together. I want to wake up every morning knowing I chose this life, chose you, and that you chose me back." Evan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "I did choose you. The moment you opened those green eyes and looked at me like you were deciding whether to trust me or not, I was done for. So ask me." "Right now, like this? I don't even have a ring, Clara. You deserve something proper, something special." She caught his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "I don't need a ring or a fancy proposal. I just need you to ask me to be your wife. Everything else is just decoration." Evan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was this woman who had survived hell itself, who could have chosen safety and society back east, asking him, a solitary cowboy with nothing but a remote ranch and rough hands, to marry her. It felt like grace he didn't deserve. He slid off the chair and knelt in front of her, still holding her hand, and Clara's breath caught in surprise. "Clara Whitmore, you walked into my life half dead, and somehow brought me back to life instead. You make me laugh, you make me think, you make me want to be the man you see when you look at me. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you've made me?" Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she was smiling so wide it looked like it might split her face. "Yes, yes, of course yes." Evan pulled her down into his arms, and they held each other, both laughing and crying at the same time, the fire crackling beside them and the wind howling outside. The whole world narrowed down to just this moment, this choice, this beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Clara wiped her eyes and laughed shakily. "That was better than anything I could have imagined. Even without a ring?" "Especially without a ring. Though I won't say no if you want to get me one eventually." "I will. I promise. As soon as the weather breaks and I can get to town, I'll find you the best ring I can afford." Clara kissed him softly. "I don't need the best. I just need one that means I'm yours and you're mine." They talked late into the night, making plans for their future. A simple wedding, probably at the Sullivans' place since it was the largest building around, and Martha would never forgive them if they didn't let her help. Spring, maybe, when travel was easier and the weather was kinder. Nothing fancy, just the people they'd come to know and care about, witnesses to the promise they were making. But as February arrived with its promise of eventual thaw, something else arrived too. A letter, forwarded through several hands, that found its way to the ranch on a day when the sun finally broke through the clouds and made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Clara brought it in from the mailbox Evan had installed at the road, her face puzzled. "It's from Boston, from my uncle." Evan felt his stomach drop. They'd assumed that matter was settled, that Clara's letter declining his offer had ended the conversation, but apparently not. Clara opened the envelope with trembling fingers and read silently, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something Evan couldn't quite read. When she finished, she looked up at him with wide eyes. "He's not accepting my decision. He says I'm being foolish, that I'm clearly not thinking straight after the trauma I've experienced. He's He's coming here. He's already left Boston. He'll be here within 2 weeks. What? Evan took the letter from her and read it himself, his jaw tightening with each line. The uncle, Gerald Whitmore, wrote with the absolute certainty of someone who believed he knew what was best for everyone. He dismissed Clara's choice to stay as the confused decision of a traumatized young woman. He insisted she needed to return to civilization, to family, to a proper life. And he was coming personally to fetch her, to see this ranch and this cowboy who had clearly taken advantage of his vulnerable niece. "He thinks you've manipulated me," Clara said, her voice tight with anger. "He thinks I'm too damaged to make my own decisions." Maybe he's right. The words came out before Evan could stop them. Maybe you are making decisions based on trauma, on gratitude for being saved. Maybe... Don't. Clara's voice cut like a whip. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't you dare doubt us now, not after everything. I'm not doubting us. I'm doubting myself. Clara, what if he's right? What if you're choosing me because you felt like you had no other choice, because I was here when you needed someone? Clara stood up, her whole body radiating fury. You think I don't know my own mind? You think I haven't spent months examining my feelings, my choices, my reasons? I'm not some fragile doll who needs a man to tell her what to think. I know that, but nothing. I chose you, Evan, not because you saved me, not because I was grateful or confused or damaged. I chose you because you're a good man who treats me like an equal, because you make me laugh and challenge me to be stronger, because when I imagine my future, you're in every single picture. Her voice broke slightly. Don't let my uncle's letter make you doubt what we both know is true. Evan stood and pulled her close, feeling the tension in her body slowly ease. I'm sorry. You're right. I know you know your own mind. I want to make sure you're choosing this for the right reasons. The right reason is love. That's the only reason that matters. But as the days passed and the uncle's arrival drew closer, Evan couldn't shake the doubts that had taken root. He found himself watching Clara, looking for signs that she was having second thoughts, that maybe the security of family and society was more appealing than the hard life of a frontier ranch. Clara seemed to sense his internal struggle. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, she set down her knife and turned to him. Talk to me. What's going through your head? Evan leaned against the counter, struggling to articulate fears he barely understood himself. What if he offers you things I can't? Security, society, an easier life. What if seeing him reminds you of everything you've lost, everything you gave up to stay here? Then I'll remember why I made that choice in the first place. Clara moved closer, taking his hands. Evan, I'm not going to lie and say the life here is easy. It's not. But it's real. It's mine. And more importantly, it's ours. I don't want easy. I want meaningful. But my uncle is a good man who's worried about me. I understand that, but he doesn't get to make my choices for me. No one does. She squeezed his hands. When he arrives, I'll tell him the same thing I'm telling you now. I'm staying. I'm marrying you. And if he can't accept that, then he'll have to go back to Boston without me. The certainty in her voice should have reassured Evan completely, but he couldn't quite silence the voice in his head that whispered she deserved better than what he could give her. Gerald Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, riding in a hired carriage that looked absurdly out of place against the rough landscape. He was a tall man in his late 50s, well-dressed in Eastern style, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of authority and respect. Evan and Clara stood on the porch as the carriage pulled up, Clara's hand tight in Evan's, her chin raised in defiance. Gerald stepped down from the carriage, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with barely concealed distaste before landing on Clara. His expression immediately softened. Clara, my dear girl, thank heavens I found you. Clara released Evan's hand and moved forward, but not to embrace her uncle as he clearly expected. Uncle Gerald, this is an unexpected visit. Unexpected? I wrote you I was coming. You wrote that you were coming to take me back to Boston. Those are very different things. Clara gestured to Evan. Uncle Gerald, this is Evan Hale. He owns this ranch. Evan, my uncle, Gerald Whitmore. The two men shook hands, Gerald's grip firm and assessing, clearly trying to take Evan's measure. Evan stood his ground, meeting the older man's eyes steadily. Mr. Hale, I understand you've been housing my niece. She's been living here, yes, after the attack on the wagon train. Gerald's expression tightened. Yes, that terrible tragedy, which is precisely why Clara needs to come home with me, where she'll be safe and cared for properly. I am being cared for properly, Clara interjected, and I am safe. Uncle Gerald, I appreciate your concern, but as I wrote in my letter, I've chosen to stay here. Chosen? My dear, you've been through an unimaginable trauma. You're in no state to make such permanent decisions. Evan felt Clara stiffen beside him and knew she was about to unleash her temper. He touched her elbow gently, a silent reminder to stay calm, and stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, I understand this must be difficult, but your niece has been here for 6 months. She's not the traumatized woman who collapsed at my gate. She's strong, capable, and very much in her right mind. Gerald's eyes narrowed. And how convenient for you, isn't it? A beautiful young woman, alone and vulnerable, arriving at your doorstep. Tell me, Mr. Hale, what exactly are your intentions toward my niece? My intentions are to marry her, sir, with her consent and blessing, which I already have. The silence that followed was deafening. Gerald stared at Evan, then at Clara, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and anger. Absolutely not. Clara, you cannot possibly be serious about marrying this cowboy. This cowboy, Clara said coldly, saved my life. He gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go, asked nothing in return, and treated me with more respect than any man in Boston society ever did. So yes, Uncle Gerald, I am absolutely serious about marrying him. You're making a mistake. You're throwing away your future out of some misguided sense of gratitude. I'm creating my future. There's a difference. Gerald turned away from them both, clearly struggling to control his temper. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. Clara, please. Think about what you're giving up. In Boston, I can provide for you a proper home, society, opportunities. You could meet suitable men of your own class and education. I don't want men of my own class. I want Evan. You want him now, perhaps, but what about in 5 years, 10? When the novelty of this rustic life wears off and you realize what you've sacrificed. Clara's laugh was sharp and bitter. Novelty. Uncle Gerald, I've hauled water in freezing temperatures, birthed a calf with my own hands, and lived through a blizzard that nearly killed us both. There's nothing novel about this life. It's hard work every single day. But it's my work, my choice, my life. Then you're a fool. The word hung in the air like a slap. Evan took a step forward, anger flaring hot in his chest, but Clara's hand on his arm stopped him. Perhaps I am, Clara said quietly, but I'd rather be a fool who chose her own path than a wise woman who let others choose for her. Gerald looked at his niece for a long moment, something like grief passing over his features. Your mother would be heartbroken to see what you've become. It was a low blow, and everyone knew it. Clara went pale, but her voice remained steady. My mother would want me to be happy. And I am happy here, Uncle Gerald, more happy than I ever was in St. Louis, playing at being someone I wasn't. I don't believe that. Then stay, Clara challenged. Stay for a few days, see how we live, see who I've become. And then, if you still think I'm making a mistake, I'll listen to whatever you have to say. But you have to actually see my life here before you judge it. Gerald looked like he wanted to refuse, but Clara's steady gaze and reasonable tone left him little choice. Fine, I'll stay 3 days, but I'm warning you, Clara, nothing I see here is going to change my mind. We'll see about that. The next 3 days were among the most tense Evan had ever experienced. Gerald stayed in the spare room, the one Evan had been using as a bunkhouse, and spent his time observing everything with a critical eye that missed nothing. He watched Clara work in the kitchen, tended the animals, mended clothes. He watched Evan repair fence, break ice from the water troughs, maintain the property. And he watched the two of them together, the easy communication, the partnership, the small touches and shared glances that spoke of deep affection. On the second evening, after dinner, Gerald surprised them both by asking to speak with Evan privately. Clara looked worried, but Evan nodded and followed the older man out to the porch. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the snow-covered landscape painted silver by moonlight. Finally, Gerald spoke. I can see that you care for her. That much is obvious. I love her, sir. More than I thought I could love anyone. Love isn't always enough. Clara comes from a refined background. She's educated, cultured, used to society and comfort. What can you offer her here? A hard life, isolation, constant struggle? Evan chose his words carefully. I can offer her purpose, freedom to be herself without judgment, a partnership where her contributions matter and her voice is heard. And yes, love, the kind that doesn't try to change her or fit her into some mold of what a woman should be. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. She told me you refused to let her work when she first arrived, that you insisted she rest and recover without earning her keep. Yes, sir. That shows character. Most men would have taken advantage of a vulnerable woman in their debt. Clara was never in my debt. She didn't owe me anything. And that, Gerald said thoughtfully, is precisely what she's been trying to tell me. He turned to look at Evan directly. I came here expecting to find her being manipulated or coerced. I expected to find a man taking advantage of my traumatized niece. And what did you find instead? I found a woman who's stronger than I gave her credit for. A woman who's found something I'm not sure I can argue against, no matter how much I might want to. Gerald sighed heavily. She's happy here. I didn't want to see it, but she is. She smiles more in one evening with you than she did in 6 months in St. Louis before the journey west. Evan felt some of the tension in his chest ease. So you'll accept our marriage? I didn't say that. Gerald's voice was sharp again. I said I can see she's happy, but happiness and wisdom aren't always the same thing. This life is hard, Mr. Hale. What happens when the hardship becomes too much? When the isolation drives her mad? When she realizes what she's given up? Then I'll support her in whatever decision she makes. I won't hold her here against her will. But I don't think that's going to happen, sir. Clara's tougher than you think. She survived 3 weeks alone in hostile territory. She can survive anything. Gerald studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Tomorrow, I want to speak with Clara alone. Will you grant me that? Of course, but the decision is hers to make. I know. That's what frightens me. The next day, Clara and her uncle took a long walk together across the snow-covered property. Evan watched them go, Clara's arm linked through Gerald's, their heads bent together in conversation. He forced himself to stay at the ranch, to trust Clara to handle this on her own. They were gone for over 2 hours. When they finally returned, both of them looked exhausted but calmer. Gerald's expression was unreadable, but Clara's eyes found Evan's immediately, steady and sure. Uncle Gerald and I have reached an understanding, she announced. He's accepted that I'm staying here and marrying Evan. Relief flooded through Evan like a wave. Thank you, sir. Gerald held up a hand. Don't thank me yet. I've agreed to accept it, but I have conditions. Conditions? Clara's voice was wary. First, you write to me regularly. At least once a month. I want to know you're well and happy. That's reasonable. I can do that. Second, if you ever need anything, money, help, a place to go, you contact me immediately. No pride, no hesitation. I'm still your family, Clara. And I take care of my family. Clara's eyes grew damp. I understand. Thank you, Uncle Gerald. And third, Gerald turned to Evan, his expression stern, you treat her well. You make her happy, because if I hear otherwise, I will come back here and there won't be any polite conversation. Are we clear? Evan met his gaze squarely. Crystal clear, sir. And you have my word. I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of her. Gerald nodded, then surprised them both by pulling Clara into a tight embrace. I'm trusting you to know what's best for yourself, he murmured. Don't make me regret it. I won't, Clara promised. I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. Gerald left the next morning, the carriage pulling away with him looking back once at the ranch, his expression still uncertain but resigned. Clara and Evan stood on the porch, her hand in his, watching until the carriage disappeared from view. Are you all right? Evan asked quietly. I am. It was hard, having to defend our choices to him, but I think he understands now, or at least he's trying to. He loves you, that's why it was hard for him to accept. I know. Clara leaned her head against Evan's shoulder. but I love you more, and I choose you every single time." That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara pulled out the letter from Gerald that had started everything and tossed it into the flames. They watched it burn together, the paper curling and blackening, releasing them from the last shadow of doubt that had hung over their decision. "No more looking back," Clara said firmly. "Only forward." "Only forward," Evan agreed. The weeks that followed felt like a new beginning. With Gerald's reluctant blessing secured, they threw themselves into planning their wedding. Martha Sullivan took charge with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign, enlisting the help of every woman in the territory. Clara found herself swept into a world of female friendship she hadn't expected. The ranchers' wives and daughters welcomed her with open arms, teaching her skills she hadn't known she needed: how to preserve meat for long winters, how to make candles, how to deliver a calf when the mother was struggling. In return, she taught them things she'd learned in her old life, reading and writing for those who'd never had the opportunity. Simple medicine from the books her father had carried. She was building a community, Evan realized, watching her laugh with the other women as they planned the wedding. She wasn't just surviving in this harsh landscape, she was thriving, putting down roots that went deep and strong. March brought the first hints of spring, days that stayed above freezing, nights where the stars seemed close enough to touch. And with spring came the wedding. They married on the first day of April, in the Sullivans' front room with 30 people crowded in to witness. Clara wore a simple dress she'd made herself, white muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Evan wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, his hands shaking slightly as he held Clara's and spoke the vows that would bind them together. "I promise to honor you, to respect your choices, to be your partner in all things. I promise to love you through hardship and joy, through every season we're given. I promise to see you, really see you, for who you are, and to never try to make you into something you're not." Clara's vows matched his in simplicity and depth. "I promise to stand beside you, to share the work and the worry. I promise to build our life together with honesty and courage. I promise to choose you every day for all the days we have." When the circuit preacher pronounced them married, Evan kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. But in that moment, wrapped in Clara's arms, Evan heard nothing but the beating of his own heart, steady and sure, anchored by love. The celebration lasted long into the night. There was food and music, dancing and laughter. Clara was passed from partner to partner as the men of the community each took a turn dancing with the bride, while Evan accepted handshakes and backslaps from men who'd once been strangers and were now friends. As the party wound down and people began to depart, Martha pulled Clara aside one final time. "You've made a good choice, dear. Evan's a fine man, and he'll treat you right." "I know. Thank you for everything you've done, Martha, for accepting me, for helping with the wedding, for making me feel like I belong here." Martha's eyes grew misty. "You do belong here. You're one of us now, for better or worse. And if you ever need anything, advice, help, or just another woman to talk to, you come find me, you hear?" Clara hugged the older woman tightly. "I hear. And thank you." Finally, as midnight approached, Evan and Clara climbed into their wagon and headed home under a sky full of stars. The ranch had never looked more beautiful to Evan than it did that night, knowing that Clara was coming home not as a guest or a survivor, but as his wife, his partner, his equal. Inside, Clara looked around the house with new eyes. "It's strange," she said softly. "Everything looks the same, but somehow it all feels different. Because now it's truly ours, both of us, together." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "I meant what I said in my vows. I choose you, Evan. Every day, every moment, I choose this life we're building. And I choose you. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that choice." She stepped into his arms, fitting perfectly against him the way she always did. "You already are. From the moment you carried me inside and gave me a place to rest, you've been exactly what I needed. Not a rescuer, not a savior, just a good man who saw me as a person worth saving." They stood together in the quiet house, holding each other, two people who had found each other through tragedy and loss, and had chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of one chapter into another. Clara had chosen to stay, chosen love over security, partnership over protection, and in that choice, she'd found something she'd been searching for all her life without knowing it, a place where she belonged, a purpose that mattered, and a love that asked nothing of her except to be exactly who she was. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain and full of challenges. But standing there in their home, in each other's arms, they were ready to face whatever came next. Together. Spring unfurled across the Texas landscape like a promise kept, transforming the brown earth into something alive with possibility. Clara woke each morning as Mrs. Hale now, the name still strange and wonderful on her tongue, and found Evan already up, watching the sunrise through their bedroom window with a contentment she'd never seen in him before. "What are you thinking about?" she asked one morning, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. "How different everything looks now. This same view, this same land, but it feels transformed somehow. Because you're not alone anymore." "Because we're not alone anymore," he corrected, turning to kiss her forehead. Big difference. They fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease, though not without adjustments. Clara learned that Evan snored when he slept on his back, that he was grumpy before his morning coffee, that he had a habit of leaving his boots exactly where someone would trip over them. Evan discovered that Clara was fiercely territorial about her kitchen organization, that she sang off key when she thought no one was listening, and that she had nightmares more often than she'd let on when they'd slept in separate rooms. It was after one of those nightmares, a month into their marriage, that everything changed. Clara woke gasping, the images of the wagon train attack still vivid behind her eyes. Evan pulled her close immediately, murmuring comfort, but this time she pushed him away and bolted from the bed, making it to the wash basin just in time to be violently sick. Evan was beside her in an instant, holding her hair back, his face creased with worry. "Clara, what's wrong? Was the nightmare that bad?" But Clara had gone very still, her hand pressed to her stomach, her mind racing through calculations. The missed monthly cycles she'd attributed to stress, the exhaustion that seemed deeper than just hard work, the way certain smells had been turning her stomach for the past week. "I think," she started, then stopped, afraid to say it out loud. "Evan, I think I might be pregnant." The silence that followed felt enormous. Evan's hand on her back went motionless, and when Clara finally found the courage to look at him, his expression was unreadable. "Are you sure?" "No, not completely, but all the signs are there. I should have realized sooner, but I thought—" Her voice broke. "Say something, please." Evan's face suddenly broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen on him. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." "You're happy about this?" "Happy? Clara, He seemed to struggle for words adequate to the moment. "I never thought I'd have a family. After the war, after choosing this solitary life, I'd made peace with the idea that this ranch would die with me. But now—" He placed his hand gently over hers on her stomach. "Now there's going to be a future I never dared imagine." Relief flooded through Clara, followed quickly by terror. "I don't know how to be a mother. I don't know the first thing about babies or childbirth or any of it. We'll figure it out, together, just like we figured out everything else." But figuring it out proved more complicated than either of them anticipated. Martha Sullivan confirmed Clara's suspicions a week later, examining her with the practiced eye of a woman who'd delivered half the babies in the territory. "You're pregnant, all right. Maybe 2 months along, I'd guess. Baby should come sometime in November, right around Thanksgiving." Martha's expression grew serious. "Now, I'm going to be straight with you, Clara. Childbirth out here isn't like it was back east where you came from. We don't have fancy doctors or hospitals. Women die in childbirth more often than anyone likes to admit." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but Martha gripped her hand firmly. "I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you so you understand what you're facing and can prepare. You're young and strong, and that's in your favor. But you need to take care of yourself. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest, good food. And when your time comes, you send Evan to fetch me immediately. You hear?" "I hear." That conversation haunted Clara over the following weeks. She'd survived so much already: the attack, the weeks alone in the wilderness, the harsh winter. But this felt different, more dangerous somehow because it wasn't just her life at stake anymore. She carried a responsibility now, a tiny life depending on her body to shelter and nourish it. Evan became almost comically protective. He insisted she stop hauling water, refused to let her lift anything heavier than a cooking pot, and hovered anxiously whenever she so much as stood up too quickly. It was endearing and infuriating in equal measure. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Clara snapped one afternoon when he tried to take a basket of eggs from her hands. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still doing their work." "Not my wife, not if I can help it." "Evan, I can't spend the next 7 months sitting in a chair like an invalid. I'll go mad." They compromised, as they always did. Clara continued her lighter work, but agreed to let Evan handle anything strenuous. She cooked and cleaned, tended the chickens, worked in the garden she was planting. Evan took over everything else, often working twice as hard to make up for what Clara couldn't do. But there were moments of pure joy, too. The first time Clara felt the baby move, a flutter so faint she almost missed it, she'd grabbed Evan's hand and pressed it to her stomach, though it was far too early for him to feel anything. The wonder in his eyes had made her cry. When her belly began to round noticeably, Evan would rest his hand there each night before they slept, talking softly to the baby about the ranch, about the life they were building, about how loved this child already was. Summer arrived with its brutal heat, made worse by Clara's changing body. She moved more slowly now, her center of gravity shifting, her ankles swelling in the afternoons. The work that had once been manageable became exhausting, and she found herself napping in the middle of the day despite her determination not to. It was during one of these afternoon rests, in late July, that disaster struck. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, not the familiar wood smoke from the stove, but something sharper, more urgent. She pushed herself up from the bed, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, and looked out the window. The barn was on fire. She could see Evan already there, working frantically to free the horses while smoke poured from the upper loft, where they stored hay. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a bucket and ran outside, her heart hammering with fear. "Clara, no! Get back inside!" Evan's voice was hoarse from smoke as he led the last horse to safety. But Clara was already at the well, hauling up water, her pregnant belly making the work awkward but not impossible. Other ranchers who'd seen the smoke were arriving, forming a bucket line from the well to the barn. Clara took her place in the line, passing buckets with shaking hands, refusing to stop even when Evan tried to pull her away. "The baby," he started. "The barn is our livelihood. We can't lose it." It took 2 hours to get the fire under control. By then, half the barn was destroyed, but the other half and all the animals were saved. Clara stood in the yard, covered in soot and ash, her dress soaked with water and sweat, shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. Evan swept her up in his arms, carrying her inside despite her protests. "That was incredibly stupid and incredibly brave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't ever scare me like that again. I couldn't just sit inside while everything we've built burned. You could have lost the baby. You could have been hurt." Clara pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the reassuring movement within. "But I wasn't. We weren't. We're both fine." Martha came to check on her the next day, drawn by the news of the fire that had spread through the small community. She examined Clara thoroughly, her expression stern. "Baby seems fine, thank the stars. But Clara, you can't keep pushing yourself like this. Your body is working hard enough just growing this child. You need to be more careful." "I know. I will be." But the fire had damaged more than just the barn. It had damaged their carefully maintained financial balance. The cost of repairs would eat into their savings, money they'd been counting on to get them through the winter and cover the expenses of a new baby. Evan tried to hide his worry, but Clara could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way he stared at the damaged barn with calculations running behind his eyes. "We'll figure it out," she told him that evening as they sat on the porch, both too exhausted to do more than exist. "We always do. The lumber alone will cost more than I've got saved, and we need to do the repairs before winter comes or we'll lose animals to the cold." Clara was quiet for a moment, an idea forming. What if we asked for help? Clara, not charity, not a loan, but a barn raising, the way Martha described how communities come together. We provide the lumber and food. They provide the labor. It's what neighbors do. Evan looked uncomfortable with the idea of asking for help, but Clara could see him considering it. I don't know if I can ask people to give up their time for us. You're not asking, I am. Clara stood, her hand on her belly, determination in every line of her body. We've helped others. You delivered George Sullivan's calf when it was breech. I taught Martha's daughter to read. We're part of this community now, and communities take care of their own. The barn raising was set for the first Saturday in August. To Evan's amazement and Clara's satisfaction, nearly every family within a day's ride showed up. Men arrived with tools and know-how, women brought food enough to feed an army, and even the children helped, running supplies and keeping everyone in water. Clara moved through the organized chaos, directing the food preparation, making sure everyone was fed and hydrated, feeling more grateful than she could express. This was what she'd given up Boston society for. Not isolation, but this. Real community, people who showed up when times were hard, who gave freely because they knew the same would be done for them. By sunset, the barn wasn't completely finished, but the major structural work was done. The men promised to return the following week to complete the details. As families packed up to leave, each one stopped to speak with Clara and Evan, accepting their thanks with the easy grace of people who understood that today it was the Hales who needed help, but tomorrow it might be them. After everyone left, Clara and Evan stood looking at the new barn, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. You were right, he said quietly. About asking for help. About community. We're not alone out here. We never were. We just had to let people in. August melted into September, and Clara's body continued its transformation. She was large now, moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo. The baby's movements had grown stronger, sometimes visible from the outside, little feet or hands pushing against the walls of her womb. Evan was fascinated and terrified in equal measure. He'd read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, borrowing from Martha and even sending away for medical texts. But all the reading in the world couldn't prepare him for the reality of watching his wife's body change, knowing that in a few months she would face a trial that could kill her. He didn't voice these fears to Clara, but she knew anyway. She could see it in the way he watched her, the way his hand would unconsciously reach for her belly as if to reassure himself that both she and the baby were still there, still alive. I'm going to be fine, she told him one evening in late September as they prepared for bed. Women do this every day. Women die doing this every day too. Clara took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I survived the unsurvivable, Evan. I walked for 3 weeks through hostile territory with nothing but determination keeping me alive. I'm not going to die bringing our child into the world. I won't allow it. That's not how it works, Clara. You can't just will yourself to survive childbirth. Can I? I willed myself to survive everything else. She pulled him close, resting his head against her swollen belly. This baby is going to have both parents. I'm going to fight with everything I have to make sure of that. October brought cooler weather and a restlessness to Clara that she couldn't explain. She found herself cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, organizing spaces that were already organized, preparing and re-preparing everything they might need for the baby. It's called nesting, Martha explained when she stopped by for one of her regular check-ins. Means the baby will be here soon. Your body knows, even if your mind doesn't. How soon? Could be a week, could be a month. Babies come on their own schedule. Martha's expression grew serious. Now, we need to talk about the birth itself. What you can expect, what to do when labor starts, all of it. What followed was the most frank and terrifying conversation Clara had ever had. Martha spared no details about the pain, the blood, the sheer physical ordeal of bringing a child into the world. But she also talked about the strength women had, the power of the human body to do what it was designed to do. When your time comes, you remember this. Your body knows what to do. You just need to trust it and let it happen. The pain will be bad. I won't lie about that. But it ends. And when it's over, you'll have your baby. Evan insisted on being present for this conversation, despite Martha's initial protest that it wasn't proper for husbands to know such intimate details. I'm going to be there when she gives birth, he said firmly. I need to know what to expect, how to help her. Martha had looked surprised, but approving. Not many men would say that. Most prefer to wait outside and let the women handle it. I'm not most men, and Clara isn't facing this alone. As October drew to a close, Clara felt the first real contractions, not the practice ones Martha had warned her about, but the real thing. They started in the middle of the night, a tightening across her belly that made her gasp. Evan was awake instantly. Is it time? I think so. But Martha said early labor can last for hours. We shouldn't send for her yet. They waited through the pre-dawn hours, timing contractions, Clara pacing the small house because moving seemed to help. As the sun rose, the contractions grew stronger and closer together. Evan finally rode for Martha, pushing his horse harder than was wise, driven by the fear he'd been trying to suppress for months. Martha arrived with her daughter Sarah, who'd assisted at enough births to be useful. They took over the bedroom, setting up supplies, boiling water, transforming the space where Clara and Evan had slept peacefully for months into something clinical and purposeful. What followed were the longest hours of Evan's life. He stayed by Clara's side, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, murmuring encouragement even as his heart broke watching her in pain. Clara endured it with a strength that left him in awe, walking when she could, breathing through contractions, never crying out, though he could see the agony in her face. As afternoon faded toward evening, Martha examined Clara again and nodded with satisfaction. You're ready. Next contraction, I want you to push. Clara looked at Evan, fear and determination warring in her eyes. He squeezed her hand. You can do this. You're the strongest person I know. The actual birth took another 2 hours. 2 hours of Clara pushing with everything she had, of Martha coaching and encouraging, of Sarah providing support, of Evan holding his wife and wishing desperately that he could take some of the pain for her. And then, just as full darkness fell outside, a baby's cry pierced the air. It's a girl, Martha announced, holding up a tiny, squalling infant covered in blood and vernix. A beautiful, healthy girl. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure, but reaching immediately for her daughter. Martha placed the baby on Clara's chest, and the world seemed to stop. Evan looked at his wife and daughter, both alive, both healthy, and felt something in his chest crack open. Tears streamed down his face as he touched the baby's impossibly small hand, watched her tiny fingers curl around his thumb. She's perfect, Clara whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Look at her, Evan. She's absolutely perfect. Like her mother. They named her Sarah Catherine, Sarah for Martha's daughter who'd helped with the birth, Catherine after Clara's mother. Sarah Hale, born on October 28, 1869, weighing approximately 6 pounds, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Clara recovered slowly, her body healing from the trauma of childbirth. Evan discovered he was completely useless at diapering, but surprisingly good at soothing the baby when she cried in the middle of the night. They took turns sleeping, learned to function on fragments of rest, and marveled at the tiny person who had completely transformed their lives. Martha visited regularly, checking on both mother and baby, bringing food and advice and the reassurance of experience. Other women from the community stopped by with gifts, hand-sewn baby clothes, knitted blankets, jars of preserved food to help the new parents through the demanding early weeks. You've got a good community here, Martha said one afternoon, watching Clara nurse the baby. These people care about you, both of you. I know. I'm grateful for it every day. Your uncle would be proud to see you now. You've built something real here. Clara looked down at Sarah, who was feeding contentedly, one tiny hand pressed against Clara's breast. I never imagined this would be my life. When I left St. Louis, I thought we were heading to California to start over. I never dreamed I'd end up here, with Evan, with our daughter, with all of this. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never planned for. As winter approached for the second time since Clara had arrived at the ranch, she found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. A year ago, she'd been a survivor, still healing from trauma, still figuring out who she was in this new life. Now she was a wife, a mother, a full partner in a working ranch, a member of a community. The nightmares that had once plagued her came less frequently now. When they did come, Evan was there to hold her, and increasingly the sound of Sarah's breathing from the cradle beside their bed served as an anchor back to the present. One evening in late November, as they sat by the fire with Sarah sleeping in Clara's arms, Evan spoke the thought that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Do you remember when you first arrived, when you begged to work, and I told you to rest?" "Of course I remember. That was the moment I realized you saw me as a person, not just a problem to be solved. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about rest and work and what we owe each other." He reached over to stroke Sarah's downy head. "I made you rest because I knew you needed to heal, but I think I needed to heal too. I just didn't know it until you showed me." "Heal from what?" "From being alone, from believing that needing people was weakness, from thinking that survival and living were the same thing." He met Clara's eyes. "You taught me the difference. You taught me that building a life means letting people in, accepting help, being vulnerable. I'm a better man because of you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "And I'm a better woman because of you. You gave me space to rest, to heal, to discover who I was without all the expectations and judgments of society. You let me find my own strength." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter sleep, the fire crackling softly, the wind whistling around the corners of the house. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, blanketing the ranch in white. "Are you happy?" Evan asked quietly. "Truly happy? No regrets about the life you could have had in Boston?" Clara looked around their small home, so different from the grand house she'd grown up in, but infinitely more precious because it was theirs, built with their own hands and filled with their own choices. She looked at her husband, this good man who'd saved her life and then given her the space to save herself. She looked at their daughter, this miracle they'd created together. "I've never been happier in my life," she said with absolute certainty. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." And she meant it. The frightened woman who'd collapsed at Evan's gate was gone, transformed into someone stronger, someone who knew her own mind and heart. The lonely cowboy who'd built walls around himself had opened those walls to love. Together they'd created something neither could have imagined alone: a family, a home, a life worth living. Sarah stirred in Clara's arms, making the small sounds that meant she was waking. Evan took his daughter gently, cradling her against his chest with the confidence of a man who'd learned that strength came in many forms. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "Welcome to your first real winter. Your mother and I are going to teach you everything we know about this life, about hard work and honest effort, about community and kindness, about choosing love even when it's difficult." Clara watched her husband with their daughter and felt her heart swell with a joy so intense it was almost painful. This was what she'd been searching for all along, though she hadn't known it. Not rescue, but partnership. Not safety, but purpose. Not an easy life, but a meaningful one. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the scarred earth with fresh white, promising renewal and new beginnings. Inside, a family gathered close against the cold, bound together by choice and love, and the quiet determination to build something lasting. The story that had begun with collapse and desperation had transformed into something beautiful. And though challenges would come, they always did, Clara and Evan would face them together, stronger for having found each other, ready for whatever the future might bring. Sarah's first winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. By the time spring returned, she'd grown into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone, particularly her father. Evan was completely besotted, spending every spare moment making her laugh or carrying her around the ranch, pointing out horses and chickens, and explaining ranch operations to an infant who couldn't possibly understand but seemed fascinated nonetheless. "You're going to spoil her rotten," Clara observed one morning, watching Evan bounce Sarah on his knee while trying to drink his coffee one-handed. "That's my right as her father. Besides, she's perfect. Perfect things deserve to be spoiled." Clara laughed, but there was truth in the easy happiness that had settled over their home. The ranch was prospering in small but meaningful ways. The rebuilt barn stood strong, the herd had grown, and Clara's garden promised a bountiful harvest. More than that, they'd found their rhythm as parents and partners, the balance that came from knowing each other deeply and choosing each other daily. But it was in late April, as Clara worked in her garden while Sarah napped in a basket nearby, that an idea took root alongside the vegetables she was planting. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle before daring to speak it aloud. That evening, after Sarah was asleep and they had their rare moment of quiet together, Clara broached the subject that had been occupying her thoughts. "I want to start a school." Evan looked up from the saddle he was mending, surprise clear on his face. "A school?" "There are at least a dozen children within riding distance of here, and none of them are getting any education. Their parents are too busy with ranch work to teach them, and the nearest real school is 2 days' ride away." Clara leaned forward, her enthusiasm building as she explained. "I could teach them to read and write, basic arithmetic, history, literature. My father always dreamed of education reaching the frontier. He used to say that schools civilized places more than churches or laws ever could." "Where would you hold this school, and when would you have time with Sarah to care for?" "I could start small, a few hours, 2 or 3 days a week, right here in our front room, and Sarah could be here too. She'd grow up surrounded by learning, by other children." Clara reached for his hand. "Evan, I need this. I need something that's mine, something meaningful beyond cooking and cleaning. I love being a wife and mother, but I need to be more than that too." Evan was quiet for a long moment, and Clara held her breath, afraid he'd say no, that he'd tell her a woman's place was in the home, nothing more. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Your father would be proud. Teaching those children, giving them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have, that's important work." He squeezed her hand. "But are you sure you're ready for this? Sarah's only 6 months old. That's a lot to take on." "I'm sure. And I'll need your support, your help. This can't just be my project. It needs to be ours together. Then we'll make it work. We always do." The response from the community was overwhelming. When Clara mentioned her idea to Martha, word spread quickly, and within 2 weeks, 6 families had committed to sending their children. The ages ranged from 5 to 14, a challenging mix, but Clara felt more energized than she had in months. They converted the front room into a makeshift classroom. Evan built simple benches and a larger table that could serve as Clara's desk. Martha donated some old primers and readers. Clara wrote to her uncle in Boston, asking if he could send but any books he thought appropriate, and Gerald responded with an entire trunk of educational materials and a letter expressing his pride in what she was doing. The school opened on the first Monday in June. 7 children showed up that first day, 6 who'd been promised, and 1 more whose parents had heard about it last minute. They ranged from little Emma Sullivan, barely 5 years old, to Jacob Morrison, a gangly 14-year-old who could barely write his own name but desperately wanted to learn. Clara stood before them, Sarah in a sling against her chest, and felt a wave of purpose wash over her. This was right. This mattered. "Good morning. My name is Mrs. Hale, and I'm going to be your teacher. We're going to learn together, reading, writing, arithmetic, and anything else you're curious about. But first, I want to know your names and what you most want to learn." The answers varied wildly. Emma wanted to read fairy tales. Jacob wanted to write letters. 10-year-old Margaret Chen wanted to learn about faraway places. 8-year-old Thomas wanted to know about science and how things worked. Clara looked at their eager faces and made a promise to herself and to them. She would give these children what her father had always believed every child deserved, a chance to be more than circumstance had made them, to dream beyond the boundaries of their known world. The first months were challenging. The children's skill levels varied so dramatically that Clara often felt like she was teaching 4 different classes simultaneously. She learned to be creative, having the older students help the younger ones, creating lessons that could be adapted to different levels, bringing in real-world examples from ranch life to make learning relevant. Evan proved invaluable. He taught the children practical mathematics through ranch problems, how to calculate feed needed for livestock, how to measure fence posts, how to divide up grazing land fairly. He brought in interesting rocks and plants for them to examine and classify. He even taught them basic carpentry, much to Clara's amusement. "I thought this was supposed to be a reading and writing school," she teased one afternoon, watching Evan show Jacob how to properly use a saw. "Education is education. These children need practical skills as much as book learning." "My father would have liked you. He always said the best education prepared people for the real world, not just the world of ideas." By autumn, the school had grown to 12 students, and Clara had to start holding classes 4 days a week to accommodate everyone. It was exhausting work on top of being a wife and mother, but it filled something in Clara's soul that she hadn't realized was empty. She was making a difference, contributing to her community in a way that would ripple forward for generations. The children adored her. She was patient but firm, creative in her teaching, and genuinely interested in each child's unique gifts and struggles. Parents reported that their children were reading at home, practicing their letters, asking questions about everything. The community was changing, becoming more educated, more curious, more connected to the wider world. But it was in December, as they approached the 2-year anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch, that the biggest challenge arose. Sarah had just started walking, toddling around with the determined instability of all 1-year-olds, when Clara realized she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear, only joy mixed with practical concern about logistics. How would she manage the school with 2 children? But Evan's response was immediate and certain. "We'll figure it out. Maybe we can get one of the older girls to help with Sarah during school hours, or Martha's daughter. The point is, we'll make it work because this school matters." The second pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Clara knew what to expect, perhaps because she was too busy to worry. She taught through her morning sickness, through the exhaustion, through the growing awkwardness of her changing body. The children were remarkably understanding, the older ones helping with Sarah when Clara needed a moment, the younger ones bringing her wildflowers and showing extra care. In June of 1871, Clara gave birth to a son. They named him James, after Evan's father, and he came into the world with less drama than his sister. A quick labor, a healthy delivery, Clara recovering faster than Martha had expected. "You're getting good at this," Martha joked, examining both mother and baby the day after the birth. "I wouldn't say good. Better, maybe." With 2 children now, life became a carefully orchestrated dance. The school continued with some modifications. Clara held classes 3 days a week instead of 4, and Sarah's daughter Ruth came to help with the babies during school hours. The older students, particularly Margaret and Jacob, stepped up to take on more teaching responsibilities for the younger children. It was working. Not perfectly, not easily, but it was working. Clara had found a way to be everything she wanted to be: wife, mother, teacher, member of a thriving community. The woman who'd collapsed at Evan's gate, broken and lost, was completely gone now, replaced by someone stronger, more certain, more fully herself than she'd ever been. The years that followed brought both growth and challenge. A drought in 72 tested the ranch's resources. A terrible winter in 73 took several head of cattle. Sarah grew from a toddler into a bright, curious 5-year-old who loved books as much as her mother did. James proved to be more interested in the physical world, always covered in dirt, fascinated by how things worked. The school flourished beyond Clara's wildest dreams. By 1874, she had 23 students and had convinced the community to build an actual schoolhouse on land Evan donated. It was a simple building, just one room with a wood stove and proper desks, but it represented something profound. A community's commitment to education, to their children's futures, to the idea that frontier life didn't have to mean ignorance. The dedication ceremony brought people from miles around. Clara stood with Evan, watching the children run in and out of the new building with excitement, and felt tears prick her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Evan asked, his arm around her waist. "I'm thinking about the day I arrived here, about who I was then and who I've become, about how a moment of kindness can change everything." "You changed everything, not just for me, but for all of these families, these children. We changed everything, together." Clara looked up at her husband, this good man who'd given her space to rest when she needed it most, who'd supported every dream she'd dared to voice. "Do you remember what you said to me that day, when I begged to work? I told you to rest beside me. You did. And in that rest, I found the strength to become who I was meant to be." She gestured at the schoolhouse, at their children playing with the others, at the community gathered in celebration. All of this started with that choice. Your choice to let me heal, my choice to stay, our choice to build something together. It was true. The school had transformed the community in ways neither of them had anticipated. Children who would have grown up illiterate were now reading, writing, calculating. Some of the older students had gone on to further education, returning with new skills and ideas. The community had grown more prosperous, more connected. more forward-thinking. But more than the practical benefits, the school represented something deeper, a commitment to the future, a belief that investing in children's education was investing in hope itself. Clara's father would have been so proud to see his daughter carrying forward his dream, bringing education to the frontier in a way he'd never been able to do himself. As the dedication ceremony wound down and families began heading home, Martha pulled Clara aside. "You've done something remarkable here, you know. Not just the school, though that's wonderful, but you've shown these women, these frontier wives who thought their only value was in cooking and cleaning and bearing children, that they can be more, that they can have purpose beyond their homes. I couldn't have done any of it without Evan's support. That's my point exactly. You two have shown what a true partnership looks like. He didn't tell you to stay home and be satisfied with being a wife and mother. He helped you build something bigger. That matters, Clara. That changes things for all of us." The conversation stayed with Clara as the years continued to unfold. She and Evan had become models for the younger couples in the community, a marriage built on mutual respect and support, where both partners pursued their passions while building a life together. In 1876, something extraordinary happened. The territorial governor visited their small settlement and heard about Clara's school. He came to observe a day of classes, sitting in the back while Clara taught reading to the younger students, and Jacob, now 20 years old and her assistant teacher, worked with the older ones on advanced mathematics. Afterward, the governor spoke with Clara privately in the schoolyard while children played around them. "Mrs. Hale, I'm impressed by what you've built here. The quality of education these children are receiving rivals what I've seen in much larger towns with far more resources." "Thank you, sir. We do our best with what we have. I'd like to propose something. The territory is working to establish a formal education system, teacher training programs, standards for frontier schools. I'd like you to be part of that effort, to help train other teachers, to share what you've learned about education in remote areas." Clara felt her heart race with excitement and uncertainty. That would mean traveling, being away from my family. Not extensively, perhaps a few weeks a year, visiting other settlements, conducting training sessions. Your husband and children could even accompany you sometimes. The governor smiled. "You've proven that education can thrive anywhere there's a dedicated teacher and a supportive community. Other places need to learn from your example." That evening, Clara discussed the offer with Evan over dinner while their children, now 4 of them, with twin girls born in '75, ate and chattered around the table. "What do you want to do?" Evan asked. "I want to say yes, but I don't want to neglect our family." "You're not neglecting us by pursuing something important. Clara, you've built something extraordinary here. If you can help replicate that in other places, reach more children who need what you're offering, then you should do it." Sarah, now 7 and already reading at an advanced level, looked up from her plate. "Mama, if you help other teachers, that means more children get to learn to read like me, right?" "That's right, sweetheart." "Then you should do it. Everyone should learn to read. It's the best thing." Clara looked around the table at her family, her husband, whose support had made everything possible, her children who were growing up believing that women could be teachers and leaders and more than just mothers. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived here, broken and lost, and the woman she'd become through rest, love, and the freedom to discover her own purpose. "I'll do it," she decided. "We'll make it work, together, like we always do." The years that followed brought Clara's influence far beyond her small settlement. She traveled across the territory, teaching teachers, helping communities establish schools, showing parents the value of education for their children. Evan often came with her, bringing the children, turning these trips into family adventures that exposed their kids to different places and people. The original school continued to thrive under Jacob's full-time leadership, with Clara serving as a guiding presence and occasional substitute teacher. She'd trained him well, and he'd proven to be a natural educator, patient and creative and deeply committed to the children's success. In 1880, when Sarah was 11, she asked her mother a question that showed how much had changed in the 12 years since Clara's arrival. "Mama, when I grow up, can I be a teacher like you? Or do I have to just be someone's wife?" Clara knelt down to her daughter's eye level, taking her hand seriously. "Sarah, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be a teacher, or a doctor, or a rancher, or a wife and mother, or all of those things at once if that's what you choose. The point is that it's your choice. Never let anyone tell you that being a woman limits what you can become. Is that what Grandpa Gerald told you when you stayed here instead of going to Boston? Clara smiled, impressed by her daughter's memory and understanding. Actually, your great-uncle tried to tell me I was making a mistake, but I knew my own heart, just like you'll know yours when the time comes. And Papa let you choose? Papa didn't let me do anything. We chose together to build a life where we both could be who we needed to be. That conversation encapsulated everything Clara and Evan had built together. A marriage of equals, a family where everyone's dreams mattered, a community where women could be more than their traditional roles if they chose. By 1882, 14 years after Clara's arrival, the transformation was complete. The ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. The school served over 40 students and had produced several graduates who'd gone on to become teachers themselves, spreading education even further. Clara's work with the territorial education system had helped establish standards and training programs that were raising the quality of frontier education across hundreds of miles. But more than the tangible accomplishments, what mattered most to Clara was the life she'd built. A marriage that had weathered drought and hardship and the daily challenges of frontier life, emerging stronger each time. 4 children who were growing up literate, curious, believing that their potential was unlimited regardless of their gender. A community that valued education, that supported women's pursuits beyond the home, that understood that investing in the future meant investing in children and teachers. One evening in late summer, as the sun set over the land they'd worked so hard to cultivate, Clara and Evan sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was reading to the younger ones under a tree. James was building something intricate with pieces of wood. The twins were running in circles, laughing at nothing and everything. "Do you ever think about that day?" Evan asked quietly. "The day I found you at the gate?" "All the time. It was the worst day of my life and the best day of my life, all at once. I remember thinking you looked like a ghost, like something already dead that was just taking a few more steps before finally falling." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was dead, in a way. Everything I'd been, everyone I'd loved, all of it was gone. But you gave me space to rest, to grieve, to find out who I could become. You gave me a reason to live instead of just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence, a silence earned through years of partnership and understanding. Finally, Clara spoke the thought that had been forming in her mind for days. "I want to write it all down, our story, not for publication or anything grand, just for our children and their children, so they understand where they came from, what we built, why education and choice and partnership matter so much." "What would you call it?" Clara thought for a moment, then smiled. "I can work, sir," she begged. The cowboy said, "No, you can rest beside me." Evan laughed, the sound rich and warm. "That's quite a title." "It's the truth. That moment changed everything. You could have put me to work immediately, taken advantage of my desperation. Instead, you gave me the one thing I needed most, time to heal. And in that healing, I found not just survival, but a life worth living. We found it together. Yes, together." As darkness fell and the children reluctantly came inside, Clara found herself reflecting on the long journey from that terrible day at the gate to this moment of peace and purpose. She'd lost everything: family, security, the life she'd known. But in that loss, she'd found something greater: agency over her own choices, a partnership built on equality and respect, work that mattered and reached beyond herself, a family she'd chosen and built with intention. The nightmares that had once plagued her rarely came anymore. When they did, they were distant things, memories that no longer had power over her present. She'd survived, yes, but more importantly, she'd thrived. She'd taken the broken pieces of her life and built something beautiful. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at the desk Evan had built for her and began to write. She started with the attack, with the 3 weeks of desperate survival, with collapsing at the gate. She wrote about Evan's kindness, about learning to trust again, about falling in love with a man who saw her as an equal. She wrote about building the school, about watching her children grow, about discovering that purpose could be found in teaching and learning and serving community. But most of all, she wrote about rest, about how sometimes the greatest gift one person can give another is permission to stop fighting, to heal, to discover who they really are when survival is no longer the only goal. Years later, when Clara's hair had gone silver and Evan's hands were gnarled with arthritis, they would sit on that same porch and watch their grandchildren play. The school had long since outgrown its original building, now a proper institution with multiple teachers and a curriculum that prepared students for universities back east. Several of their own children had become teachers, carrying forward Clara's legacy of education. Sarah, their eldest, had indeed become a teacher and then a school administrator, eventually overseeing education programs across 3 territories. James had become a rancher like his father, but one who believed in supporting his wife's work as a physician, the first female doctor in their territory. The twins had pursued their own paths, one becoming a writer, the other a lawyer. The community they'd helped build had grown into a proper town, with churches and businesses and opportunities that attracted families from across the country. But at its heart remained the school, the commitment to education that Clara had started in her front room with 7 students and a baby in a sling. "Do you have any regrets?" Sarah asked her mother one day, visiting with her own children. "About not going to Boston? About choosing this hard life instead of an easier one?" Clara looked at her daughter, at the accomplished woman she'd become, and smiled. "Not a single one. Every choice I made, every challenge I faced led to this, to you, to your siblings, to the thousands of children who've learned to read and dream because of our school. How could I regret any of that? But it was so hard, especially in the beginning. Hard doesn't mean wrong, and easy doesn't mean right. Your father understood that when he told me to rest instead of letting me work myself to death out of misplaced pride. He understood that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same." On Clara's 75th birthday, the community held a celebration in her honor. The schoolhouse, now one of several in the growing town, was renamed the Clara Whitmore Hale School for Education. Students from across 4 decades came to pay tribute to the teacher who'd changed their lives. The territorial governor, now a state governor as they'd achieved statehood, gave a speech about Clara's impact on education policy across the entire region. But the moment that mattered most to Clara came at the end of the evening when a young woman approached her nervously. "Mrs. Hale, you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you. My mother was one of your first students. She learned to read in your front room when she was 8 years old. Because of that, she was able to teach me to read before I ever started school. And now I'm studying to become a teacher myself. So I wanted you to know that your influence reaches farther than you probably realize. You didn't just teach my mother, you changed our entire family's trajectory." Clara felt tears stream down her face as she hugged this young woman, this living proof that education rippled forward through generations. This was what her father had dreamed of, what she'd worked so hard to build. Not just reading and writing, but transformation. Hope. Possibility. That night, as Evan helped her to bed, both of them moving slowly now, bodies worn from years of hard work, Clara reflected on the extraordinary gift she'd been given. Not just survival, though that would have been enough, but the opportunity to build something meaningful from tragedy, to transform loss into legacy. "Thank you," she said to Evan, as she had so many times over their 50 years together. "For what this time? For telling me to rest when I wanted to work, for understanding what I needed before I knew it myself, for building a life where I could be all the things I wanted to be." Evan kissed her forehead gently. "Thank you for collapsing at my gate, for choosing to stay, for showing me what life could be when lived fully, not just endured." They fell asleep holding hands, as they had for decades, 2 people who'd found each other in the darkest moment and built something luminous from the ashes of loss. Clara Whitmore Hale died peacefully in her sleep 3 years later, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, former students, fellow teachers, community members whose lives she'd touched. The school closed for the day, every student and teacher attending to honor the woman who'd believed that education could transform the frontier. Evan followed her 6 months later, as if he couldn't bear to be without his partner for long. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, with a simple marker that read, "Here rest Clara and Evan Hale. She begged to work. He told her to rest." Together they built a legacy of love and learning. But their true monument wasn't the gravestone or even the school that bore Clara's name. It was the hundreds of educated children who'd grown into adults who valued learning. It was the generations of teachers Clara had trained and inspired. It was the transformation of a frontier community into a place where education, equality, and partnership were fundamental values. And it all started with a moment of kindness, a woman collapsing at a gate, a man who chose mercy over exploitation, a decision to let someone rest instead of demanding they immediately prove their worth. That moment, that choice, changed everything. Not just for Clara and Evan, but for everyone their lives touched. It proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple kindness, that giving someone space to heal can unleash potential no one imagined, that love built on respect and partnership can transform not just two lives, but an entire community. The story of Clara and Evan became legend in that part of Texas, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But at its heart remained a simple truth that their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren carried forward, that we all deserve the space to rest, to heal, to discover who we're meant to be. And that the greatest gift we can give another person is the freedom to make their own choices, supported by love that asks nothing except the chance to walk beside them as they become their fullest selves. In the end, Clara hadn't just survived. She'd lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than she'd found it. And it all began the day she collapsed at a cowboy's gate and heard the words that would change her life forever. "No, you can rest beside me."